Hi, I'm Russell and welcome to this week's Renewables Roundup by Zeigo Network. I'm pleased to say that this week I'm joined by Killian Daly. Killian was recently talking about the gap between the renewables that we want and need and those that are being developed, and how PPAs can fill that. That is a subject very close to my heart, so obviously I needed to get Killian on the podcast. So, shall I start asking him some questions? Hi Killian, thank you so much for joining me this week. I'm really pleased to have you here. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks very much for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, excellent. I am, as I say, pleased you're here. Okay, I'm going to launch into it a little bit then. So about a week ago, I saw you had a really interesting post about the European Parliament report about long-term sort of differences between the CfD market and the PPAs. This really struck a chord for me because I did some work in like late 24, early 25, more UK focused, and it talked about something similar, which was that gap between what we need and what we're delivering and how the PPA can do it. And particularly, you said something along the lines of PPAs are where renewables meet the market. I thought that's absolutely right. So what, if I can ask you this firstly, what's your view? I mean, obviously you sort of you saw the report. Do you think there is a gap between what we are delivering in Europe, you know, from CfDs and PPAs and generally, and you know, how do you feel that gap could be filled?
Yes, in short, it's very clear there's a gap, right? That Parliament report that you mentioned, it's pretty striking. Essentially, PPAs and CfDs at current rates are only making up about a third of the renewable investment needs in Europe, if we want to reach our renewable targets, right? So like that's a major gap. We have to find other ways to plug it. I don't see a lot of other good options. So I think really, in particular, growing the PPA market is going to be really, really important to de-risking these vital investments in renewables and flexibility. So yeah, and that's something very, very close to my heart. Like obviously in EnergyTag, we're a non-profit, kind of working on market design and PPAs, renewable procurement. I've worked in heavy industry before on the buy side of PPAs. So it's something I've been thinking about for a long time.
Excellent. I would agree with you. I think what the analysis I did, which was the UK stuff, showed that, you know, as we go out towards 2050, there's a developing gap, and that gap got quite big. I think at that point I was saying we needed to build 16 gigawatts a year just to hit the 2030 targets. And yeah, it seemed obvious to me that the corporate PPAs could easily hit half of that, just from looking at what was there. Do you think there's anything specific that, you know, let's say government or the energy market generally might want to do or needs to do to drive and support PPAs?
Yeah. So basically, I think there's various people have different views on this. I come from the buy side, and so I look at it very much in terms of two things. What green credentials is the PPA bringing, but honestly, more importantly, what kind of hedging value is it bringing to my portfolio? And we have seen, in the last 3 years, the European PPA market has started to stagnate and actually decline over the last few years in terms of volumes. One of the main drivers is essentially the fast drop in the capture value of renewables, particularly solar. So just basically like the value of electricity delivered by a solar PPA is getting further and further away from that baseload price. So I think we really need to focus, whether that's the market itself, and that's already kind of starting to happen. I would argue also that governments should get involved potentially where needed in helping develop portfolio PPAs, combining wind, solar, and batteries together to really deliver kind of firmer renewable PPAs that are delivering, a greener profile, but also a far more effective hedge against, spot market volatility. When the sun goes down at 7 or 8, if that PPA is there to protect you, I think it's going to be a much more valuable product.
That's really interesting. I really like that. I think certainly I would agree. I've seen that I think the PPA market got a bit overheated
Hmm.
on the back of the high gas prices caused by the Ukraine conflict, and 2025 saw that to me drop back and potentially drop back to the sort of almost like a pre-pandemic, certainly pre-conflict equilibrium where
Yeah.
the market prices, PPA prices, as you said, the hedge value, all are very close. So, when you lost the big impetus to say, hey, there's a great ESG
Mm.
reason for doing that. And you can say to the FD as well, oh, and by the way, this is a hedge against our power prices, and it's a good one right now. It makes it a no-brainer, and that's
Yeah.
definitely gone away, I think.
Hmm.
So I think that's really interesting. Um, I the thing about firming PPAs, I think is really interesting. We've seen a lot of virtual PPAs. I think it's fair to say across Europe. I'm wondering if the shift in the GHG protocol requirements to sort of
Hmm.
more matching and locality
Hmm.
might see a little bit more of a push towards the should we say the physical delivery where the hedge is a bit more obvious. Um, and I think that could certainly, that could certainly bring things out. Because a bit like you, I mean, I've worked on the, should we say, the
Hmm.
supply side more, but for so
Hmm.
many years I've worked with corporates, and you see those same things every time. You see the things they say. How does it fit into my portfolio? And
Yeah.
base load's easier to get into the head and things like that. For me, I think credit could be a big thing because I think the blue chip companies, they've done what they're doing. Do you think a solution where maybe governments could stand some credit against PPAs could unlock that next level, a bit more of the PPA market?
Clearly, especially as you mentioned, for those smaller players who just don't have the financial muscle, the balance sheet to really like support what is a very significant commitment, right? Like a 10, 15-year power contract. You're talking tens, hundreds of millions of dollars or euros of financial commitment. For big blue chip companies, that's one thing, but obviously for smaller SMEs, for example, that's far more complicated. So I think things like even aggregating pools of companies to lower risk profiles, getting governments involved in guarantees. The EIB, European Investment Bank, has a guarantee scheme pilot ongoing at the moment. I think all of that can help get new players into this market. It won't be a panacea. It won't be the only solution to all our to, let's say, the next generation of PPAs, but I think it can be an important one. One thing you could also look at is a kind of hybridization potentially of government support and PPA. So like maybe you could have a 20-year CFD or a 15-year CFD. You cut off the first maybe 5-10 years of that, have it in a corporate PPA, and then the tail is covered by the government. So that way you really start to get another, I think, branch of consumer into the market who maybe is not comfortable going to 10, 15 years, but 3 to 5, happy days. Like that's really a more typical like calendar product. So the products, let's say, go out 1, 2, 3, 4 years, start to get low liquidity. So maybe
Yeah.
there's stuff to think about there as well.
I love that idea, and you know what? I think that's great because you're absolutely right. I would see the same things. 3 to 5 years is a much easier commit for a corporate
Mm.
of almost any size. And they can look at it very directly and make decisions. But that's never going
Hmm.
to drive an investment, as you say. But
Yeah.
saying, well, if you've got
Hmm.
5-year PPA, we'll give you a late 5-year
Hmm.
CFD. You go, well, I've got it done, haven't I?
You could have a,
And
a win-win, yeah, yeah. Because
yeah.
I do think what we need to do, right, is like eventually move away from, for the renewable transition to just become, completely embedded, I would say. We need to make sure that the PPA product is just something that consumers want, like because it's green, but also just because it's good risk management, it's good hedging, and I think we need to get as many people into the market as possible. We need to get the product as robust as possible. So, like, God forbid the day where government comes in and says, "Hey, all right, we're scrapping our PPA CFD scheme," rather. Well, it doesn't really matter as much because the market has taken over, and there's just value in that product. And I think this is one of the most important I think it's one of the most misunderstood things about the energy transition. To be honest, we always talk about, renewable LCOE, how renewables are getting cheaper, how batteries are getting cheaper, but I think we often forget that actually getting this stuff built needs long-term commitments from someone.
Yeah.
And I think it's not just because solar is super cheap on paper that it's going to get built. We need people to actually bet on that for the long term. And so I think, yeah, that's something we need to kind of be ultra focused on and delivering both from the market and the policy side.
That's really good. It's really interesting. I like that. I'm old enough to be able to remember the sort of in the UK the opening up of the supply market. Never mind the PPA market, right?
Okay.
And I can go back to things like NETA and better. But anyway, the point of that that fabulous fact is that. When those things started, they were all quite niche. They started with big customers. They were very niche. People talked about, well, do we need standardization? How do we encourage people to get into this? But what happened is, because what you were saying there, the market grew and more people got involved. Standardization happened automatically because the competitors in the market looked at each other and went, oh, well, we can't have that silly clause in our supply contract because no one wants it and it keeps getting taken out. Everyone else is not doing it. And on those things, what eventually arrived was something that was well enough to understood to become pretty much commonplace if you're an energy buyer. Yeah. And I would love PPAs to be on that transition path, because you don't need to then have an argument about, well, do we need a standard effect PPA? No, because people would just come, and I see it already, you look at lots of different PPAs and they've all got fairly standard clauses in them. They're really similar, and it's just just the detail that gets looked at. So I really, I agree, and it'd been interesting to see if governments could just like pick at it a little bit. How you say that kind of hybrid support, some interest, and just get it going.
That's something that I know. I don't know if it's controversial, but the talk about standardization, it definitely splits people. I think to some, people who think absolutely not. We can never standardize PPAs. I would challenge that. I think when you look at, large markets, I know some people would not call a PPA a commodity, but if you look at, I kind of think for it to really, really become wholesale, it probably has to go that way, right? If you look at how commodity markets work in other sectors, there's high level of standardization. People understand the product. Like look at futures markets in electricity. There's highly standardized calendar products. And it's just super. That was my job before. I used to hedge power, and like it's just super easy. Management understands it. Everyone knows what they're getting into, and that's how volumes can really, start to explode. So I'm not saying every PPA should be mandatorily standardized, but I think moving towards something where it's a bit more off the shelf. And as you mentioned already, Russell, that's kind of happening anyway. I don't think that is a bad thing. That might not be great for certain, maybe for the lawyers or whatever, but they'll always find something else to do because it's still a large deal, and there's always going to be things to figure out, right? But I kind of do think we need a bit more standard product here because it's pretty. Yeah, I think it's overly varied and complex.
Yeah, I think the legals are often about a barrier to entry. And you're right. The contract is only part of it. I think that a lot of the legal houses provide advice and confidence around it when it's new. It's not just about the legals. And I do, and I think sometimes, I've seen it, but people get a bit bogged down in something in the legals that maybe they don't need to. So I get that. What would be interesting to me is I wonder if there's almost a secondary market on PPAs to say, look, I've got one, maybe I can trade it on. And you might say, why would you want to do that? Well, you might say maybe something's changed. I've divested half of my business, and I want to divest half of my PPA, and the person who's buying it already has one, so I'm going to put that somewhere else. There could be reasons why you could de-risk it by saying, actually, you could enable almost a wholesale market in PPAs and allow people to kind of true up bits and pieces between themselves. I don't know. It's a bit pie in the sky. One thing I was going to briefly ask you about was I'm quite interested because of your background and where you are. Is GHG
Hmm.
is obviously talking much more about matching, yeah, as well as
Yeah,
locality.
yeah.
In your view, if this is not
Hmm.
like a really leading question, what do you think
Hmm.
it might do to the PPA market if they do proceed with hourly matching requirements in the GHG protocol?
Well, I think, fundamentally, the more matched a PPA is anyway to your demand, the more hedging you are getting. That's just a fact, right? Power markets settle at a 15-minute basis now in Europe. To be hedged, it has to be in the same bidding zone. Otherwise, there's a basis risk. So, anyway, in Europe, I think 85% of PPAs are physical, last year. So I don't really see a move to a more, let's say, granular reporting having significant negative effects on the European PPA market. If anything, I think it might bring out the value a bit more of these hybrid PPAs, which today we don't really see. It could also help maybe accelerate some of the stuff around guarantees of origin for storage and including storage and PPAs. Only one country in Europe today even has RECs or GOs for storage. So I think
Mm,
we do need to focus more on that. On the VPPA point, obviously if you have a VPPA and you have consumption in the same bidding zone, then, you're still going to be doing matching. Obviously, there is a part of the market who do want to procure large amounts of electricity, and maybe where that doesn't even match where they're consuming that. You'll still be able to account for that. There's a second metric going to be introduced in the electricity reporting, more to do with like the positive consequential benefits you're having from signing PPAs. The other thing I think it would do, and I know that from personal experience, I think it would make it much more complicated to take other options to buy renewables. Like most renewable claims today in Europe, 70% plus are from, unbundled guarantees of origin costing 50 cent. So especially as budgets tighten and things like that in companies, that is the obvious financial choice, right? In terms of getting a green target, you just buy the certificates and don't, necessarily get involved in PPAs. So I think it would make it much harder for these ultra cheap green claims to happen as well. So yeah, that's my view on that one. I know the topic is controversial to an extent, and not everyone agrees with that view. But I think we kind of need to move things forward a bit. This standard will only come in place after 2030. All existing PPAs are going to be grandfathered in anyway. And I would find it pretty strange if the value of the green value of a PPA was the same in 2040 as it was back in 2010 or 15.
yeah, yeah, it makes sense. I think certainly we're seeing with corporates, grandfathering is an interesting one. I think there are some corporates
Mhm.
who are thinking, I'm going to move now. And I'm going to, maybe do what I was going to do anyway and get it grandfathered, and I'm going to get something done.
Mhm.
I think we are also seeing other corporates who are, what would I say, thinking a little more strategically and thinking, well, actually, maybe I've
Mhm.
already got my, pan-European virtual. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm interested in that wind in Eastern Europe. Because
Mhm.
it is a bit close to my center of demand, and it still makes sense, and it's a different it's different. I think what I come to is that ultimately the market will continue. I think potentially it'll change shape. I think in some places like the UK where you see a lot, they're
Mhm.
almost all physical. It's more of a reporting thing, and maybe then people will say, well, actually, I'm glad I bought that wind, and I don't really want another solar. I think I'll get a wind. It'll shift the buying decisions. But I think that'll be true right across Europe. I think the corporates will
Mhm.
still look at it and say, if I need to decarbonize, how do I do it? But I do think you make a good point. I think um, there is significant financial pressure, geopolitical pressure and economic supply
Mhm.
chain and everything else. I think there has been a rhetoric, I'm going to say, coming out of the US that has been a
Mhm.
bit sort of, well, what's all this green really about? And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
corporates are looking and saying, are we on target? There's a bit of uncertainty. what's the best thing to do at this time? How do we manage it? Because we've got
Hmm.
many challenges, and clearly
Yeah.
finance is one of them, and that's what's going to worry them. I think is how do I still get the PPA with the kind of increasing complexity of the match, the locality, but
Hmm.
also the good, as you were saying right at the top, a good hedge. But
Yeah.
I think it's doable.
I know, and I think there's been numbers out of for example, the IEA looked at actually basically on an LCOE basis, the cost of different levels of firmness of renewable PPA across Europe, right? Like and the US and China, in fact, and compare that to standard industrial retail tariffs. They actually found like firm 80%, 90% hourly matched green PPAs are actually on a cost basis already competitive with standard retail prices for power in Europe. So it's coming quick, and
Yeah.
I think batteries are going to change the game really fast on that one, and that's what will make the PPA market ultimately, unavoidable, even if we continue this path of green not being as important, or we start to listen to Donald too much. I think because companies anyway want to protect themselves against volatility and spot, because they want to take a long-term view if they're a big industrial player, want to make a big investment. I think like combining renewables in a smart way is able to hedge over much longer periods than you ever could with like through gas markets, for example. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind. And finally, on the physical side, maybe that's another kind of contrarian view, but I always thought, like, again, I come from heavy industry background, margins are tight, volumes are huge. There will always be a much deeper market for physical electricity than I think for virtual electricity. Companies will always spend more on power that they actually need to run their operations. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind when we think of accounting standards and we think of policies. That's ultimately what's going to make this market, I think, kind of bulletproof, for want of a better word.
Yeah, it's about how you align lots of little things to make the big thing work.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, makes sense. And you know
and it's
what? I
not
think you. Go
simple.
on, sorry.
Like,
No, no.
I think we are going through there. I know that like the likes of Pexa Park do a lot of really good writing on this. Their recent, I think their 2026 report was like the big repricing. We are in a bit of a time of change, probably. The products of the last 10 years won't be the same as the products of the next. There's a lot of positives in that as well. I think things like batteries and flexibility is coming, is going to come big time into these markets. But yeah, like obviously people are used to doing things one way. And so it's not always easy to change. And there's lots of little things that have to happen. And we do have to be careful when we transition between products, between standards, etc. We have to make sure that the market doesn't find it too much at once.
Yeah,
But
no,
I think, yeah.
it's an interesting change, and you're right. I was speaking to a developer not long ago, and I was surprised how competitive they were. They were giving me some numbers, sort of pay as produced and base loaded, and I was
Mm.
surprised how little the difference was.
Yeah.
But even knowing what's going on in the market around balancing and other costs, I was kind of like,
Mm.
that's actually really as a shift, that's really competitive, and that
Yeah.
and maybe that's an area we'll see change. Um,
Mhm.
Killian, we've talked a lot. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate you coming and
Yeah.
sharing your views. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Russell. Thanks for having us on.
No worries. That was a really interesting discussion this week. And if any of those issues have resonated with you and you'd like to find out more or get some more data or perhaps just talk about things, then you can find out what we do at Zeigo Network by going to zeigo.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you.